Hi guys, how are you all today morning? Good morning. Today is 13th July 2023. My name is TSV Raghavan and I live in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. This is my spiritual vlog on YouTube. Haribol TRSV Nectar NECTAR Nectar. In this particular vlog, in all my previous videos, we have been discussing about the knowledge and information that we have gleaned through the study of spiritual books, scriptures, contemplation on the material universe, and meditation on the spiritual universe. This particular video in this vlog is no exception to that rule. In fact, it is a mere continuation of all that we have been doing in my previous videos. Kindly subscribe to this vlog and press the bell icon so that I may keep reminding you of all my other videos. So let us talk about the topic for today's video. Till yesterday, we talked about how Genesis happens, how the continuous cycle of endless births and deaths happens to a spirit soul when it is enveloped by four layers of material body. We have also talked about ether, air, fire, water, and earth, the five elements that constitute these four layers of material body. Today, we shall also talk about a very perennial and important element that plays a lot of role or part, a long part, and a very important part in the life of a living entity and the spirit soul. This particular element is known as ego. This ego is in three parts. They are false ego, ego, and super ego. False ego happens when a particular spirit soul, which has now become a human living entity, identifies itself, himself, or herself with the body of that living entity. In other words, if a living entity takes birth in one of its endless different lifetimes, then if the same living entity begins to identify himself, herself, or itself with that body of that particular birth only. In such a case, that ego is known as false ego. This false ego is a catalyst or a cement, a glue or a gum that pastes the four layers of the body of that living entity in that particular birth together. In other words, the causal body of intelligence, the astral body of mind, feelings, and emotions, and the etheric body of senses, plus the gross body itself, are all joined through to each other through a glue known as false ego. This false ego is not only useful in making or breaking the endless karma of that particular living entity, but it also helps him or her to get slowly spiritual and become self realized. The second is where the same living entity identifies himself or herself with the spirit soul that he or she originally is. In such a case, this person tries, tries to ignore the endless cycle of births and deaths that that particular living entity has to go through. He or she only identifies with the actual spirit soul that he or she originally is. In such a case, that ego which identifies this particular living entity with his or her spirit soul is known as real ego or plainly just ego. When a living entity begins to identify himself or herself with the original spirit soul that he or she is, in such a case, this person is already on the path of liberation from this endless cycle of birth and death. Such a person has to be necessarily self realized because in the spiritual world, the liberation or the act of liberation begins where self realization ends. When the living entity is able to understand that he or she is not the body that he or she finds himself or herself in a particular birth, then that particular living entity identifies himself or herself with the original identity of his or her spirit soul. In such a case, this particular living entity wants to shed all the karma or destiny of a material world from his or her body and psyche and become liberated from these endless cycles of births and deaths. This act is known as liberation. The third ego is where the same living entity identifies himself or herself as a part and parcel of the super soul and the supreme personality of Godhead. In such a case, this person is already self realized, already liberated, and is on the path of the third stage in the spiritual world called deliverance. In deliverance, that particular spirit soul tries to become a part and parcel of the super soul. In such a case, this person does become a part of and parcel of the super soul one day or the other, and henceforth, even if he or she has to come back to this material world, either he or she comes back in a subtle body or in a gross body to carry out just an assignment of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Henceforth, this particular spirit soul becomes only an emissary of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, we know the identity of the three types of ego that plague a spirit soul and a living entity. As soon as this person becomes a self realized soul, this person starts identifying with his or her original form as just the spirit soul, and that is known as the real ego. Till then, when this person was not self realized, he or she was identifying with his or her body only. In other words, this person or this living entity must have passed through several births as cell, amoeba, algae, worm, insect, reptile, amphibian, shrub, weed, tree, bird, and last of all, as human being. Even as a human being, it is quite possible that this particular living entity has to go through almost 50% of the 4 lakh species of human births. But just because during this time this living entity turned towards spiritualism, he or she began identifying with his or her original identity as the spirit soul. However, once that person has become a spirit soul as an identity, he or she wants to go back to his original form where he or she wants to lose his or her identity as a spirit soul and become a part and parcel of the original spirit soul or super soul that is known as super ego. Our all human beings' actual aim is to first go spiritual, then become self realized, then realize our true identity as a spirit soul, and then try to blend ourselves with the super soul. Super soul is only an extension of the supreme personality of Godhead. Once we begin identifying ourselves with this super soul and become one of those with a super ego, then we need not worry as individuals about our own destiny. Our destiny ceases to exist. We now have become only a part and parcel of the super soul. In such a case, we either remain with the Supreme Personality of Godhead as His servants, which is our original identity, or come into this material world only when the Supreme Personality of Godhead condescends to give us a divine assignment. From then on, we cease to exist as an original individual identity, but spirit soul. We are only here as emissaries of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. All prophets, godmen, then saints, rishis, maharishis, etc., are already either emissaries of the Supreme Personality of Godhead or are trying to become such emissaries. Please remember that once you become an emissary, you don't take up a material assignment. You only take up a divine assignment of elevating the status of the already existing and suffering other living entities in this material world. Jesus Christ, Guru Nanak, Prophet Muhammad, Puttapurti Sai Baba, Shirdi Sai Baba, and other such godmen, including Babaji, the Maha Avatar, Lahiri Mahashay, etc., are such emissaries of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality understands a particular living entity fully well in and out, even better than what the particular living entity himself does or herself does. A particular living entity may maximum know only about his or her endless births and deaths and some individuality in himself or herself when as a spirit soul he or she originally got in touch with this material world. But the Supreme Personality of Godhead understands in and out every spirit soul also, as a result of which the Supreme Personality of Godhead decides on what assignment this person deserves to execute. That depends on the evolvement of that particular living entity and spirit soul. Some are more equal than others. Some are not even qualified to take up an assignment. They are people who have only freshly been delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. They still need a long way to go in the path of spiritualism till they get qualified to take up a divine assignment. However, depending upon the maturity and evolvement of a particular freshly delivered soul, he or she may be sent along with the original spiritual guide as his or her devotee or servant so that this person may help the original spiritual guru to carry out his or her assignment. As for example, Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ, etc., had their own followers. Similar was the case with Maha Avatar Babaji. In such cases, these souls who became followers and devotees of that soul which has been directly sent as an emissary are also qualified in themselves to jointly carry out a divine assignment. I will give you another example. Jesus Christ had 12 followers, including James and other such people. They were all spirit souls who had become delivered but were not matured enough to carry out a divine assignment themselves. However, they were evolved enough to become the followers of such a person as Jesus Christ. Same was the case with the followers of Prophet Muhammad and other such godmen. Those examples of such followers are the followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, then the Pandava brothers who were followers of Lord Krishna, then Draupadi who considered Lord Krishna as her brother, Yashoda who considered him as her son, Devaki same, the person who gave birth to Lord Krishna, Balarama who is considered to be so evolved that in some cases he is considered to be an incarnation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself, plus the Gopikas and the Gopakumaras who lived with Lord Krishna as his friends and devotees. Such people are evolved and delivered spirit souls who are considered fit enough to be close to that person who has come here to execute a divine assignment. Same is the case with Lahiri Mahashay, Swami Yukteswaragiri, Sri Yogananda Paramhansa, all from the Yogoda Satsang Society of India, who are directly or indirectly emissaries of the Maha Avatar Babaji, plus his other devotees like Panchanan Bhattacharya and uh, Bhagri. There was one saint called, one levitating saint called Bhaguri, some Yatindranath Bhaguri also, plus the devotees of Guru Nanak, devotees of Mahavir Jain, etc. These original Mahavir Jain, Gautama Buddha, Guru Nanak, such people were sent here as on a divine assignment to carry out some purpose of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the other followers and devotees were just there to help him. Not only that, it is not necessary that a follower or devotee need come here as a follower of the actual Guru in a gross body. There are several people or births of living entities who are delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who do not don a gross body, but they remain in a subtle body and help this person in his or her divine assignment. Such people who prefer to remain in the background in a subtle body are known as sattas in Hindi. There may be some other technical word for such people. They only help this particular godman from the back or from the subtle side to facilitate this particular person to carry out his or her divine assignment. So we must remember that these people need not do their work completely on their own to carry out a divine assignment. There are devotees, followers, and servants who have already donned a gross body or remain in a subtle body and help facilitate the completion and successful execution of a divine assignment. There is one Gayatri Baba who is known to be helped by several subtle forces which help him from the background with a faceless identity to carry out his or his yagyas which were pertaining to the welfare of humanity in this society. We were talking about ego. Now we know in detail about the various categories of ego. These divine people have that super ego where they don't identify their individual living entity or spirit soul parts. They just want to be a part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We all should aim at that as our ultimate bull's eye. We also must evolve ourselves to such a levitated position that we are also selected at least as a servant, a follower, or devotee of some very elevated soul. Complete several such assignments as devotees, followers, and servants, and then get qualified one day or the other as the actual person to carry out a divine assignment. That is all for today. Kindly let me know what you think of my talk on this particular subject about ego. Please give me your own expert thoughts, ideas, views, and opinions so that I may blend everything together for the sake of this society. We will do this only as our own parts to play as divine emissaries of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We may still be in the self-realized stage or even before that. We have just entered the spiritual path, but yet we may try to be one forgettable part of this giant wheel of divinity and spiritual assignment for the sake of this society. Any work done in the spiritual side is blissful and full of joy. Let us try to be a part of such spiritual assignments and do our own bit to elevate the humanity of the society in this material world to reach self realization, liberation, and ultimate deliverance. Before continuing, before concluding, I would like to remind you that I am also a published author with Amazon Kindle and paperback. I write on spiritualism, fiction, and assorted subjects. Spiritualism happens to be my favorite subject. Till we meet in my next video, it is good morning from TSV Raghavan.